Hey everyone, in this video we'll talk about imaginary and complex numbers. And just to give an introduction to imaginary numbers, first let's start with what we know. Let's say we had 3 squared. So as we know, 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. Perfect. And let's say we had negative 3 squared. So negative 3 squared is negative 3 times negative 3, which also equals 9, positive 9. Even though we have a negative times a negative still gives us a positive. And same thing here. So any number squared will give us a positive number. So another example, negative 4 squared. That is negative 4 times negative 4, which is positive 16. Good. And now let's do this in reverse. Let's say we wanted to take the square root of 9. So the square root of 9 is 3. And it could also be negative 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Same thing with the square root of 16. It could be 4, or it could be negative 4. Okay, so we know that squaring all these numbers will give us a positive number. No matter if we're squaring a positive number, or if we're squaring a negative number, we will still get a positive result in the end. So now my question is, what is the square root? What is the square root of negative 9? Well, let's try to think about it. What number squared will give me 9? Or will give me negative 9? Well, we know that 3 times 3 gives us positive 9. And we know that negative 3 times negative 3 will still give us positive 9. So it doesn't really seem like we could figure out the square root of negative 9. Well, let's try to break it down even further. If you remember the product rule for radicals, and let me actually erase most of this. Let's get rid of all of this. If you remember the product rule for radicals, then you might remember one way to represent this is by taking the square root of negative 1 times positive 9. So negative 1 times positive 9 gives us negative 9. And then the product rule for radicals, we could go ahead and separate these two. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. And we know what the square root of 9 is. The square root of 9 is 3. That's 3 times the square root of negative 1. But now we're stuck on the same problem. What's the square root of negative 1? It seems like no matter what two numbers I multiply, I can't get it to be a negative number. So the fact is that no real number squared, so any real number squared will always be positive, so is always positive. That is a fact. It's always positive, any real number squared. So real numbers won't help us take the square root of negative 1. So what will help us is imaginary numbers. So imaginary numbers is what we have to use. Imaginary numbers. Okay, so let's talk about imaginary numbers. So we can take the square root of negative 1. In fact, the square root of negative 1 equals, and we represent this with the letter I. There we go. So we use the letter I to represent the square root of negative 1. Remember, square root of negative 1 is I. And what else does this mean? Well, okay, we have this imaginary number I. Can we square it? Sure, if we square I, this I squared equals negative 1. And there we go. This imaginary number I that we have just written down, I squared equals -1. Perfect. So we can find the square root of -9. Let's go back to that problem. Square root of -9 equals the square root of -1 times the square root of 9. And what is the square root of -1? That is I. And what is the square root of 9? That is 3. So I times 3. And we like to represent this as 3i. 3i is the answer. Therefore, the square root of -9 is 3i. So that's how imaginary numbers work. And now let's talk about complex numbers. Complex numbers. So let's scroll down a little bit and let's talk about complex numbers. So a complex number is a number that has a real part plus an imaginary part. So to write down an example of a complex number, here is 6 plus 3i. There we go. So 6 right here is a real number. So 6 is a real number. And 3i is an imaginary number. It's an imaginary number. So this is the real part. 6 is the real part, and 3i is the imaginary part. And taken together, this entire thing together is a complex number. So a complex number is simply a number that has a real part and an imaginary part added together. Perfect. So let's go ahead and give one more example of a complex number. Let's say we were given the square root of -9 plus 5, and we were asked to evaluate this. Well, okay, the square root of -9, we saw in the problem above, this evaluates to 3i. So 3i plus 5 is what we have, because the square root of 9 is 3, and then the square root of -1 is just I, so that's 3i plus 5. And with any complex numbers, we always like to have them in a plus bi form. So we always like to have them in this form, a plus bi form. So let's go ahead and put this complex number we came up with in a plus bi form. So what is a? A is the real part, and bi is the imaginary part. So where's the real part here? Well, our real number is 5. So let's put that 5 first, that positive 5, plus our imaginary part is 3i. So let's put that imaginary part second, 3i. That's our bi term right here, our imaginary part, 3i. And there we go. We put our complex number in a plus bi form. And that's how it's done. So that's what you have to know with regards to imaginary numbers and imaginary numbers and complex numbers. I hope this video helps and it serves as a good introduction to these types of numbers. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and thank you for watching.